I want you to imagine a man following footsteps in the sand. He walks through thorn bushes and swamps, desperately pursuing the footprints. Eventually, he finds their source. The footprints stops under a tree. So he sits down and lights a fire and waits. Waiting for the second coming of John Chilembwe.
This is a story told by the poet Jack Mapanje. In fact, the idea is part of a Malawian folk myth. John Chilembwe will make everything shine, sing churchgoers in rural Malawi. Like Jesus, he will come again to save the world. But who is this John Chilembwe, who has inspired such devotion? To discover, one must imitate the man in the story, follow the footprints of Africa's revolutionary prophet, through swamps and thorn bushes. This is a search for the Chilembwe tree. "150 years ago, the fertile lands south of Lake Malawi were in chaos. Traders from the coast had brought guns to the Yao around the lake. The Yao people had begun attacking and enslaving other groups. To the east, the Portuguese were expanding their plantations. Thousands of Lomwe fled the system of forced labour. Very soon, the British government would follow and pacify the area.
So John Chilembwe was born into a chaotic world. Everything was changing, and he was caught right in the middle. His father was Yao, and his mother was a Manganja slave. He might have learned farming from his mother and how to use a gun by his father. Then he encountered Christianity when missionaries started a church near his village.
Many different Protestant denominations were operating in the area, and this opened up jobs for a young man like Chilembwe.
So there was a man who hired John Chilembwe. His name was Joseph Booth. So this Joseph Booth was an independent radical missionary who later became famous for his book Africa for Africans. And he was very critical of colonialist attitudes of other churches and how they treated Africans, because they believed in equality, which was a foreign concept at the time, given that people were being colonized and enslaved all over Africa.
Chilembwe grew up in Booth's house and discovered a very different way of life. Unlike the Yao, Booth was a committed pacifist. Unlike the other missionaries, Booth would allow Africans to become full church members. Unlike plantation owners, Booth used farming projects to fund mission work.
Then in 1897, Booth went to America to raise money for his projects. Alongside, he took John Chilembwe with him, and this was John's first time leaving his native country.
In America, Booth and Chilembwe attracted a lot of hostile attention. They were chased and stoned by white mobs for sharing a room. Because of this, Booth introduced Chilembwe to African American Christians. Aged 27, Chilembwe was offered a place to study at a black Baptist college.
So Chilembwe then studied African American history. He studied the works of Booker T. Washington, and this helped him understand the deep underlying issues that his people were facing at the time. His education in America filled his life with a new vision and a new purpose, which was to uplift and empower his people, the humble Africans who were under the brutal hands of colonial tyranny in Nyasaland. With the little funding he received from his American friends, John Chilembwe returned to Africa a changed man. Joined by two African American missionaries, John Chilembwe then established the Providence Industrial Mission near the village he was raised in.
PIM preached a gospel of learning, personal responsibility, and self-improvement. By 1912, almost 2,000 pupils studied in its schools. Chilembwe's training in America had convinced him that Africans, once educated, would be able to hold their heads high alongside white Europeans.
And whilst driving forward this civilizing mission, he fell in love with a woman who was in his class. Ida Chilembwe then gave him 2 sons and a daughter. She made sure that the Providence Industrial Mission was up to standards as compared to other white missions. She made sure that everything was up to standards, from the grounds to the flowers, everything. And she was also a teacher who taught sewing and manners in her husband's school.
Her husband also cut a striking figure. In colonial Nyasaland, he stood out as a black man with hat, suit, and Western manners, a lonely icon bridging 2 worlds. Chilembwe's relationship with other white missionaries was mostly friendly, but he developed a strong dislike for European plantation owners. It was a mutual hatred, and one which would come to define his life and death. The missionary explorer David Livingstone famously planned to bring Christianity, commerce, and civilization to Africa. He believed plantations would create jobs, helping to educate Africans and make them good Christians. In Nyasaland, the Scottish organisation Bruce Estates justified itself in these terms. A distant relative of David Livingstone, William Livingstone, was the plantation manager. The colonial government had allowed the estate to buy vast swathes of land and then evict Africans living in the area. Those who did not leave had to pay rent by working in the cotton plantations.
For most people, the demands by the estate were way too much.
In 1912, a famine swept through Portuguese East Africa. At the same time, Portuguese estates began expanding a ruthless system of labour. Fleeing the estates and famine, Lomwe refugees flooded into Nyasaland, and finding nowhere to go, they settled on Bruce Estates.
They had to come out of the frying pan and into the fire.
The British authorities watched as William Livingstone exploited these desperate refugees. Chilembwe began to focus his time and efforts on helping the refugees. He started churches and encouraged education. Unfortunately, William Livingstone objected to this. Churches built by Chilembwe were burnt down.
So Livingstone and Chilembwe were 2 completely different individuals. And as time passed, the hatred between them intensified. Livingstone saw Chilembwe as a freak. He felt that they were not equals, and he refused to give Chilembwe any sign of respect.
For many years, Chilembwe tried to change things through the system. He wrote impassioned letters to the colonial government about the estates. Nothing happened.
And by 1914, 2 global events fueled John Chilembwe's fire.
Charles Russell, leader of the Jehovah's Witnesses, predicted the end of the world. Pamphlets about the prediction arrived in Nyasaland from South Africa, and Chilembwe began to baptize more of his followers. At the same time, the First World War broke out. Chilembwe was horrified as he watched the British send Nyasaland soldiers to fight the Germans in East Africa. Knowing a letter to the colonial government would be ignored, he instead published his complaints in the Nyasaland Times. He argued Africans had no quarrel in this war of European empires. It was shameful they should have to shed their blood over a cause which is not theirs. For Chilembwe, the war was like the Bruce Estates injustice, magnified to a global scale.
So the letter raised his profile in the protectorate, and the governor was planning to deport John Chilembwe to Mauritius. But before this happened, John struck first.
The prophecies and conflicts sweeping through Nyasaland disrupted the quiet life of ordinary people. Suddenly, the colonial government seemed weak and vulnerable. God, or the Germans, could end British rule overnight. Perhaps it just needed a push to get things started.
So for the first time, John Chilembwe departed from Booth's pacifism. He wanted to start an uprising against the authorities. In the north, he connected with Christians who believed that the end time was near. And in the state of Blantyre, he found educated Africans who were frustrated with the colonial system. And in Bruce estates, the migrants were ready and willing to follow him and his vision.
In January 1915, Chilembwe launched the revolt. Its rallying call was an echo of Booth's book, Africa for the Africans. On Bruce estates, Chilembwe's small force broke into the plantation compound. Several African and European overseers were ended. William Livingstone was beheaded, but Chilembwe insisted no women or children be harmed.
Sadly, things went terribly wrong. In the north, the revolt didn't happen, and in Blantyre, it happened, but they couldn't get through the armory. But even if they did succeeded, the biggest challenge Chilembwe had was he had hoped that a lot of people would have joined his forces, but they didn't because a lot of people by 1915 were not politically conscious.
The Sunday after the revolt, Chilembwe held a service with his followers. Outside, above the neat flower beds, was Livingstone's head on a pole. It was a powerful image, a reflection of the hypocrisy of the colonial system, and a declaration of freedom. But with the failure of the uprising elsewhere, Chilembwe's position was unsustainable. He and a group of followers retreated towards Portuguese East Africa. Soon the colonial army was mobilized and searching for him. The sun was setting as Chilembwe and his followers navigated the dense thickets, their hearts pounding with fear and hope. They were close to the Portuguese border, a line that could mean safety or death.
Chilembwe still in his suit, his spirit unbroken. His followers saw his weakened body, burdened by the struggle of his people. But his eyes, they reflected the dream, the future of the African people. But the colonial army had caught up to them. Shots were fired, killing Chilembwe on sight. The revolutionary man was gone. "60 years later, as independent African countries began to write their own stories, Chilembwe became an icon of resistance. Long before people were fighting for national independence, Chilembwe had fought for Africa for the Africans. When Jack Mapanje wrote his poem about a man waiting for the second coming of John Chilembwe, he was living under the dictator Kamuzu Banda. For many Malawians, it felt like Chilembwe's work was unfinished. Even though Malawi was an independent country, people still lived in fear of the government. Many were poor and uneducated. They struggled to stand up to big business or politicians. In this world, you had to watch your back and be careful what you wrote. The true message of Mapanje's poem was hidden. So the man is waiting under the tree. He cooks, he sleeps, and he waits under the Chilembwe tree. Then a child from the nearby village passes by and sees him, mistaking him for Chilembwe. John Chilembwe is here! And then the man finds it funny at first. But then he has this realization. He has to become John Chilembwe.
A big thank you to My Roots for collaborating on this video. Why not check out his channel?